In the third month of 1943, when winter was giving way to the promise of spring in distant northern lands, something extraordinary unfolded across the tropical waters of the southwestern Pacific. A group of vessels moved with purpose through the waves, 8 cargo ships laden with human lives and war material, surrounded by the protective embrace of destroyers whose cannons pointed skyward in silent vigilance. The men aboard those ships carried with them a confidence born from months of successful crossings, from the belief that their steel guardians and disciplined formations would keep them safe from whatever the enemy might throw at them from above. They had watched American bombers before, watched them drop their payloads from such great heights that the ships below had all the time in the world to twist and turn away from the falling explosives. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for what was racing toward them across the horizon that morning. Machines that would refuse to climb high into the safety of the clouds, that would instead come screaming across the wave tops with a fury unlike anything they had ever witnessed. The waters of the Bismarck Sea lay relatively calm as the new day began, sunlight dancing across the surface in patterns that might have seemed beautiful under different circumstances. Standing on the command bridge of one of those transports, the Kios Maru, a senior army officer named Tishi Nakamura surveyed the scene before him with practiced eyes. He was a colonel, a man who had seen his share of combat and understood the rhythms of military operations. This particular voyage struck him as unremarkable, almost mundane in its execution. The 8 merchant vessels in his convoy were packed with soldiers, thousands of fighting men who would soon join their comrades in the desperate struggle for control of New Guinea. The destroyers that circled them like protective wolves bristled with anti-aircraft weapons, their crews drilled and ready. The morning air was clear, visibility excellent. For the troops crammed into the holds below deck, suffering the heat and the smell and the constant motion of the sea, it was simply another phase of the journey to war, another day closer to whatever fate awaited them in the jungles ahead. But hundreds of miles away, at primitive airfields carved from the Australian wilderness, a different kind of preparation was reaching its crescendo. Ground crews worked with desperate intensity, their hands black with grease and their faces lined with exhaustion. They loaded ammunition belts that seemed to stretch forever, each one holding hundreds of heavy-caliber rounds. They checked and rechecked the strange modifications that had been made to their bombers, modifications that transformed them from conventional aircraft into something entirely new. Pilots hunched over crude maps and intelligence reports, committing to memory the profiles of enemy ships, studying the angles and speeds that would make the difference between success and a watery grave. What they were about to attempt flew in the face of everything their training had taught them, violated every principle of safe bombing doctrine. They would have to fly low, terrifyingly low, into the teeth of enemy fire. They would have to hold their course while tracers reached out to claw them from the sky. They would have to trust in speed and surprise and the revolutionary weapons their bombers now carried. The shadows that appeared on the horizon that morning moved with unnatural speed, staying so low to the water that they seemed to merge with the sea itself. These were not the high-altitude formations the Japanese had learned to track and evade. These machines hugged the surface like hunting animals, and as they closed the distance, the men on the ships could see that their noses were different, solid and dark, studded with what looked like multiple gun barrels, all pointing forward in hungry anticipation. The peace of morning disintegrated in an instant. The sound came first, a rolling thunder of engines pushed to their limits, followed immediately by the distinctive hammering chatter of heavy machine guns firing in sustained bursts. Then came the bombs, not falling from high above but skipping across the water like flat stones thrown by a child at play, except these stones carried hundreds of pounds of high explosives, and they were aimed with deadly precision at the waterlines of ships that suddenly seemed very fragile and exposed. Within minutes, vessels that had seemed solid and permanent began to transform into floating infernos. Colonel Nakamura found himself gripping the railing of his bridge, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were witnessing. How could medium bombers pose such a threat to warships? The question had barely formed in his thoughts before the answer revealed itself in smoke and flame and the terrible scream of metal being torn apart. The 8-gun installations in the noses of those American B-25 Mitchells were delivering the answer, and it was written in a language of destruction that needed no translation. The closing months of 1942 had transformed the Pacific Ocean into a battlefield of almost incomprehensible scale. Japanese forces had pushed their empire's boundaries to seemingly impossible distances, from the frozen approaches to Alaska in the far north all the way down to the steaming islands of the southern hemisphere. Each captured island, each conquered territory, required constant supply. Convoys of merchant ships had to cross vast stretches of ocean, carrying everything from ammunition to rice, from replacement troops to medical supplies. These lifelines kept the distant garrisons alive and fighting. Without them, the soldiers on those remote shores would find themselves stranded, cut off, doomed to slow starvation or eventual surrender. The Japanese Navy took this responsibility seriously, assigning destroyer escorts to protect the vulnerable cargo ships, training gun crews to repel air attacks, maintaining the flow of supplies with methodical precision. For the Allied forces, the situation had grown increasingly desperate. General Douglas MacArthur, whose name would become legendary but who in those dark days was struggling simply to hold on, commanded troops that clung precariously to patches of jungle in New Guinea. The great southern continent of Australia lay exposed and vulnerable, its northern approaches practically defenceless. Every Allied airbase in the region existed on borrowed time, small islands of resistance in a sea of Japanese advance. The man responsible for air operations in this theatre, a lieutenant general named George Kenney, who commanded what was officially known as the 5th Air Force, faced a problem that robbed him of sleep night after night. The Japanese convoys moved with relative freedom across the seas, and the conventional methods of attacking them had proven utterly inadequate. The standard doctrine called for bombers to climb to 20,000 feet or higher, where they would be safe from most anti-aircraft fire, and then release their bombs while flying straight and level, trusting in sophisticated bomb sights to guide the explosives to their targets far below. But this approach, which worked reasonably well against stationary targets on land, failed completely when applied to ships at sea. A bomb dropped from 4 miles up took a considerable amount of time to fall, and during that descent, a ship moving at 20 knots could cover hundreds of feet. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. By the time the bomb reached the altitude where the ship had been when it was released, the vessel had moved somewhere else entirely. Captains learned to watch the bombers above them, wait for the telltale moment when the bomb bay doors opened, then order a sharp turn. The bombs would fall harmlessly into empty ocean, creating spectacular fountains of water that posed no threat to anyone except perhaps some unfortunate fish. American bomber crews risked their lives, flew through anti-aircraft fire, held their formations with discipline and courage, only to watch their targets steam away untouched. The tonnage of bombs dropped grew larger with each passing month. The tonnage of ships actually sunk remained frustratingly small. The Japanese, for their part, placed enormous faith in traditional naval concepts. Their doctrine drew heavily on the teachings of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the American naval theorist whose books had influenced maritime strategy around the world. The Japanese believed in the decisive battle, in the idea that well-protected fleets brought together for a climactic engagement would determine the course of the war. They surrounded their precious cargo ships with destroyers whose guns created overlapping fields of fire. They trained their anti-aircraft crews relentlessly, drilling them until they could track and engage high-altitude bombers with practiced efficiency. To the commanders overseeing these convoys, air power represented an irritant, a nuisance to be endured, but certainly not a mortal threat. Their confidence was not mere bravado. It was based on months of experience watching American bombers fail to inflict significant damage. But some Allied officers understood a crucial truth that would reshape the entire war. The jungles of New Guinea could not be conquered and held without constant resupply. Every single sack of rice that fed a Japanese soldier, every crate of ammunition that kept his rifle firing, every replacement trooper sent to fill the gaps in decimated units, all of it had to cross the sea. These supply lines were the arteries that kept the Japanese war machine functioning in that theatre. If those arteries could be severed, if the flow of supplies could be stopped, the entire enemy presence in the region would slowly bleed to death. The strategic concept was sound. The question that haunted Allied planners was simple and terrible in its implications. How? How could they cut those supply lines when conventional bombing had proven so ineffective? How could they sink ships that seemed to dance away from every attack? In the early weeks of 1943, something began to change at the dusty, primitive airfields scattered across northern Australia. In maintenance hangars and workshops, mechanics and pilots started having conversations about revolutionary ideas. They began to ask dangerous questions and imagine radical solutions. If bombs dropped from high altitude could not hit moving ships, what if they delivered those bombs at sea level instead, where the targets had no time to maneuver? If the defensive armament on standard bombers was too light to effectively suppress enemy fire, what if they removed the bombardier from the nose and filled that space with machine guns? Lots of machine guns. Enough guns to sweep an enemy deck clean of anyone foolish enough to remain standing. These ideas were radical, bordering on heretical. They violated every principle taught in flight school. They seemed to guarantee casualties that would be unacceptable. But desperation has a way of making the impossible seem reasonable, and the Allied forces in the Pacific were growing desperate. The Japanese, meanwhile, remained wrapped in their confidence like a comfortable blanket. Their intelligence officers reported that American tactics remained clumsy and ineffective. Their ship captains grew bolder with each successful crossing. Colonel Nakamura, standing tall aboard his transport as it ploughed through the waves toward its destination, embodied that confidence perfectly. He believed absolutely in the convoy's safety, convinced that the 7,000 soldiers packed into the holds of the 8 transports would successfully reach the garrison at Lae and turn the tide of battle in New Guinea. What he could not see, what his intelligence reports failed to tell him, was that a revolution in aerial warfare was being quietly perfected at those distant airfields. The men working on those modifications, the pilots training in the new tactics, they were creating something that would shatter Japanese confidence and rewrite the rules of war at sea. In a workshop that smelled of oil and hot metal, an officer named Paul Gunn stood studying a B-25 Mitchell bomber with the intensity of a sculptor examining a block of raw marble. Gunn was not a typical military officer. His background was unconventional, a former Navy pilot who had been born in the American South and spent years living in the Philippine Islands. When the Japanese invaded those islands, his family disappeared into the horror of internment camps. What remained of Paul Gunn after that loss was a man consumed by a cold rage that sharpened rather than clouded his thinking. His grief became fuel for genius. When he looked at the B-25 Mitchell, he did not see what it was. He saw what it could become. The Mitchell had been designed as a medium bomber, a reliable workhorse meant to carry bombs to targets at moderate altitudes. Its distinctive feature was a glazed nose section, a transparent dome where a bombardier would crouch behind the famous Norden bomb sight, that supposedly miraculous device that promised to drop bombs into pickle barrels from 20,000 feet. The bombardier would peer through his sight, make tiny adjustments, wait for the perfect moment, then release the bombs while praying the calculations were correct. For attacks against land targets, particularly cities and industrial facilities, this system worked reasonably well, but against ships that could turn and accelerate, it was worse than useless. It gave the crews false hope while guaranteeing failure. Gunn imagined something completely different. He pictured tearing away that fragile glass nose and replacing it with solid metal. He envisioned mounting machine guns in that nose, not 1 or 2 but 4, then 6, then 8 heavy-caliber weapons, all firing forward simultaneously. In his mind's eye, he saw the bomber no longer floating high above the battlefield like some detached observer. He saw it charging like an enraged bull, screaming across the waves at full speed, its nose breathing fire that would shred anything in its path. It would not be a bomber anymore, not in the traditional sense. It would be something new, a flying destroyer, a gun platform with wings, a machine designed for one purpose, to kill ships at close range. Working alongside Jack Fox, who represented the North American aviation company that built the Mitchell, Gunn began turning his vision into reality. In workshops that were barely more than sheds, mechanics stripped away bombardier stations with cutting torches. They fabricated heavy metal mounts and bolted them into the aircraft's structure. They ran ammunition feeds from storage boxes to the guns, testing and retesting to ensure the belts would flow smoothly, even while the aircraft was maneuvering violently. Each 50 caliber machine gun they installed could fire nearly 800 rounds per minute. Each bullet was a 4-ounce projectile of steel-jacketed lead travelling at speeds that would tear through human bodies and punch holes in steel plate. With 8 guns firing together, the bomber could deliver more than 6,000 rounds per minute, a rate of fire that exceeded some naval destroyers. The B-25 Mitchell was no longer merely an aircraft. It had become a predator with metal fangs. But raw firepower alone would not solve the problem of actually hitting ships. Another officer, a major named William Benn, who commanded a bombardment squadron, wrestled with the question of accuracy. He had watched too many missions end in frustration, watched bombs fall uselessly into the ocean while Japanese ships maneuvered away without even scratching their paint. He began experimenting with an idea that was childishly simple in concept but terrifyingly difficult in execution. He called it skip bombing, and the principle drew on memories of skipping flat stones across the surface of a pond. The technique required pilots to fly at wave-top height, so low that the aircraft's propellers were only feet above the water. They would accelerate to maximum speed, charging straight toward an enemy ship while every gun on that vessel fired at them. At the last possible moment, literally seconds before collision, they would release their bombs. The explosives would skip across the water's surface like those flat stones, bouncing once or twice before slamming into the target ship at or below the waterline, exactly where the armor was thinnest and where a breach would flood the vessel most rapidly. A single bomb detonating at the waterline could rip a hole large enough to doom a ship within minutes. The tactics were brilliant. They were also terrifying. Pilots would have to dive their bombers to an altitude of 200 feet or less and hold that height while flying at 300 miles per hour directly at ships whose entire purpose was to shoot down aircraft. They would fly straight into storms of anti-aircraft fire, tracers reaching for them like grabbing fingers, shells exploding around them in black flowers of shrapnel. They would have to hold their course, steady and true, while every instinct screamed at them to turn away, to climb, to do anything except continue flying toward what looked like certain death. And they would have to judge the release point perfectly. Too soon, and the bomb would skip past the target. Too late, and they would collide with the ship they were trying to destroy. There was no middle ground, no margin for error. Every run would end in either success or death. Gunn's multi-gun nose and Benn's skip-bombing technique merged into a revolutionary doctrine. The two concepts supported each other perfectly. The aircraft, carrying all those forward-firing machine guns, would make the initial pass, its 8 guns blazing as it swept the enemy deck, killing anti-aircraft crews before they could effectively engage the following bombers. With the defenders dead or diving for cover, the skip-bombing aircraft would come in behind, releasing their payloads with the kind of accuracy that had been impossible from high altitude. The crews trained obsessively, practicing their runs against hulks anchored in harbours, attacking the same targets over and over until the timing became instinctive, until pilots could judge the release point without conscious thought, until gunners could track and engage targets while the aircraft was turning violently. By the early months of 1943, workshops across the theatre had converted dozens of standard Mitchells into these new gunships. Some mounted 4 forward-firing guns, others carried 6, and a fortunate few had been equipped with the full 8-gun installation. But the nose guns were only the beginning. Mechanics added dorsal turrets with twin 50s, waist positions where gunners could fire from the sides, even cheek pods bulging from the forward fuselage, each one housing another machine gun. The finished aircraft bristled with weapons from every angle until they seemed less like conventional bombers and more like flying fortresses of a different kind, not built for altitude but for close-quarters combat at sea level. The men who flew them began speaking of their aircraft in almost mythical terms. They said they were riding dragons. They were not entirely wrong. The transformation of these bombers carried significance beyond mere technical innovation. For the Americans and their allies, struggling to stem the Japanese tide, these modified aircraft represented hope reborn from desperation. The concept had emerged from grief, sharpened by necessity, perfected in secrecy and sweat. Soon, these dragons would roar into battle, and when they did, they would demonstrate how a single revolutionary idea could transform the course of a war. The Japanese had no knowledge these creatures existed. They had no idea what was coming for them across the waters of the Bismarck Sea. Night settled over the airfields of New Guinea like a heavy shroud on the 2nd of March in 1943. While the Japanese convoy continued grinding southward through increasingly rough seas, another kind of storm was gathering on Allied runways hundreds of miles away. Portable floodlights cast harsh shadows across lines of B-25 bombers, their newly modified noses dark and menacing in the artificial illumination. Mechanics worked with desperate energy, checking every bolt and connection, sliding seemingly endless belts of 50 caliber ammunition into the feeding mechanisms, ensuring every gun would function when the moment came. The smell of aviation fuel and gun oil filled the night air, mixing with the acrid scent of cordite from ammunition being loaded. Bombs were rolled across the steel matting that served as runways, each one carefully secured beneath the wings of aircraft that would carry them into battle at dawn. Inside crude wooden structures that served as briefing rooms and quarters, pilots bent over maps that showed more blank space than detail. The target was clear enough. 8 enemy transports and their destroyer escorts were steaming toward the New Guinea coast, specifically toward the garrison at Leh. The mission parameters, however, were unprecedented in their audacity. The attacking bombers would not climb to safe altitude where anti-aircraft fire could be evaded and enemy fighters would struggle to reach them. Instead, they would go in low, incredibly low, so close to the wave tops that a moment's inattention could send them plunging into the sea. They would fly straight at the enemy at maximum speed, holding their course while Japanese guns tried to blow them from the sky. It was a gamble with stakes that could not be higher. Every man in those briefing rooms understood the odds. Some crew members sat quietly writing letters to families they might never see again, folding the pages carefully and tucking them into pockets, hoping someone would find them and send them home if the worst happened. Others cleaned weapons with almost religious devotion, not because the pistols strapped to their hips would make any difference if they went down in enemy-controlled waters, but because the familiar ritual of field stripping and reassembling a firearm gave their hands something to do while their minds raced ahead to tomorrow's battle. Photographs emerged from wallets and flight jackets, pictures of wives and sweethearts and children, faces that would give pilots something to focus on when the fear threatened to overwhelm them. The images were studied, memorized again though they had been memorized 100 times before, then pressed close to hearts that beat faster with each passing hour. The training had been intensive, week after week of practice runs until skip bombing felt like second nature. But every man present understood the difference between training and combat. Tomorrow the enemy would shoot back. Tomorrow there would be no friendly ships playing the role of targets, no safety boats standing by to fish them out of the water if something went wrong. Tomorrow would be real in a way nothing had been real before. The atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken thoughts. Conversations died to whispers or stopped altogether. Cigarettes glowed like small beacons in the darkness outside the barracks. A chaplain made his rounds, speaking words of comfort that no one quite heard through the roar of anticipation in their own heads. The men were not really seeking spiritual reassurance anymore. They had moved beyond that. They were preparing themselves mentally for what came next, for the moment when training and reality would collide, when split-second decisions would mean the difference between going home and dying far from everything they had ever known. Far out at sea, aboard the transport Kios Maru, Colonel Nakamura gathered with his fellow officers for a spare evening meal. The food was plain, the portions modest, but the conversation was confident, almost relaxed. They discussed plans for unloading their cargo of troops once they reached Leh. They talked about how these reinforcements would strengthen the garrison, perhaps turn the tide of the New Guinea campaign. They spoke of inevitable victory with the certainty of men who had not yet learned to fear what could come from the sky. The previous American air attacks, those high-altitude bombing runs that had accomplished nothing except disturbing the fish, had actually reinforced Japanese confidence. Why should they fear bombers that could not hit anything? The colonel ate his meal with good appetite, secure in his faith that the destroyer escorts circling their convoy would keep them safe. Those warships were like wolves guarding sheep, their guns creating protective zones that no aircraft would dare penetrate. As the night wore on toward dawn, the storm that had providentially hidden the convoy for 3 long days began to break up. Over the Bismarck Sea, clouds parted and stars appeared. By first light, the weather was clearing rapidly into crystalline tropical perfection. For the Allied airmen preparing to attack, it seemed like divine providence had opened a curtain specifically for their performance. Reconnaissance flights confirmed what intelligence had predicted. The convoy was exactly where it was supposed to be, steaming steadily on its final approach to Leh, less than 100 miles from safety. The window of opportunity had arrived, and it would not remain open long. At first light, the sound that would define that day began to echo across the airfields. Engines coughed to life, one after another, building to a sustained roar that drowned out all conversation. The B-25's Mitchells, their noses heavy with guns and their bellies loaded with bombs, began to move. One by one they rumbled down the primitive runways, engines straining against the weight they carried, wings shaking with the vibration of barely contained power. Dust rose in great plumes behind them as they accelerated, then lifted away from the earth, climbing into formation with practiced precision. Behind them, silence fell across the airfields, an oppressive quiet broken only by the wind and the distant sound of engines fading into the morning sky. Those left behind could do nothing now except wait, counting minutes, listening for the sound of returning aircraft. The crews who climbed into that morning sky knew exactly what awaited them. Intelligence had provided detailed information about the convoy's defences. 8 destroyers were known to be present, each one a floating arsenal of anti-aircraft guns. The crews manning those weapons had been drilled extensively. They knew how to create overlapping fields of fire. They had practiced tracking high-altitude targets until the movements became automatic. But what they had not practiced, what they had no experience with, was dealing with aircraft that refused to climb, that came at them skimming the wave tops at speeds that made accurate tracking almost impossible. The Japanese had no experience with aircraft mounting 8 forward-firing machine guns. They had never faced skip-bombing attacks. They had no idea what was racing toward them across the steadily shrinking distance between hunters and prey. This was not simply another mission. This was a test of everything the Allies had learned about innovation and adaptation. It was desperate courage challenging comfortable doctrine. It was new ideas hammering against old certainties. Colonel Nakamura, standing on his bridge as morning light spread across the calm sea, felt nothing but tranquility. The horizon was empty. The sky was clear. To his experienced eyes, the voyage was essentially over. In a few hours they would reach Leh and begin unloading their precious cargo of troops and supplies. He had no inkling that across that empty horizon, shadows were already racing at wave height, closing the distance with terrible speed, carrying with them the end of his convoy and perhaps the end of Japan's dream of conquering New Guinea. The road to battle had been long. The battle itself was about to begin with a violence that would shock both sides. The morning of March 3rd in that fateful year, 1943, began with a calmness that seemed almost mocking in retrospect. The Bismarck Sea lay relatively peaceful, its surface broken only by the steady wakes of 8 Japanese transports and their destroyer escorts. Aboard the transport Kios Maru, Colonel Tishi Nakamura reviewed paperwork related to the supplies they carried, completely unaware that within the hour history would pivot on an axis of fire and destruction. The clock read 10:15 in the morning when the first sirens began their wailing alert. Radar operators aboard the destroyer escorts, hunched over their primitive equipment, called out bearings with voices that carried an edge of confusion. What their screens were showing them did not match their expectations or their training. They were not seeing the expected high-altitude formations that they had learned to track and engage. Instead, their equipment showed tiny contacts skimming just above the water, moving with a speed that seemed almost impossible, closing the distance at a rate that gave very little time for preparation. Sailors on deck strained their eyes toward the horizon, searching for the threat their radar had detected. Then the sound reached them, a deep and rolling thunder that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. It was the combined roar of dozens of aircraft engines being pushed to maximum power, a sound that vibrated through the hulls of the ships and into the bones of the men who heard it. The first aircraft to reach the convoy were not American. They were Royal Australian Air Force Bristol Beaufighters, twin-engine aircraft that were sleek and deadly, designed for exactly this kind of low-level attack. They came in like hunting hawks, their cannons already firing before most Japanese gunners had even reached their positions. Streams of shells tore across wooden decks, splintering structures and cutting down sailors who were still trying to understand what was happening. The Beaufighters were not attempting to sink ships, not yet. Their purpose was to suppress the defences, to kill anti-aircraft crews before those crews could establish effective fire against the bombers that would follow. Within seconds, the immaculately maintained decks of the Japanese escorts were transformed into charnel houses, slick with blood, littered with bodies and parts of bodies. And then the B-25 Mitchells arrived. Colonel Nakamura stepped out onto the wing of his ship's bridge at precisely the wrong moment to maintain his peace of mind. He saw them coming, and his first thought was simple disbelief. These were twin-engine bombers, medium-sized aircraft that should have been attacking from comfortable altitude. Instead, they were racing across the surface of the water so low that their propellers seemed to be cutting spray from the wave tops. Their noses were wrong. Where there should have been glass domes with bombardiers visible inside, these aircraft had solid metal noses that bristled with what looked like dozens of gun barrels. There were no bombardiers visible. There was nothing visible except those black muzzles pointing forward like the fangs of some mechanical predator. The lead Mitchell, piloted by an officer named Ed Larner, bore down on the transport Teiyo Maru with single-minded purpose. At 500 yards, still closing at 300 miles per hour, its 8 forward-firing guns erupted simultaneously. The effect was like nothing anyone aboard the Japanese vessels had ever witnessed. Tracers connected the aircraft to the ship in streams of light. Glass exploded into fragments. Steel deck plates peeled away under the hammering impact of hundreds of armor-piercing rounds. Men disappeared, simply ceased to exist as the torrent of fire swept them away. At 300 yards, with the ships growing huge in the pilot's windscreen, bombs released from beneath the wings. They did not fall. They skipped forward across the water like stones thrown by giants, bouncing once, twice, then striking the hull of the Teiyo Maru precisely at the waterline where armour was thinnest and the damage would be most catastrophic. The explosion that followed seemed to lift the entire ship momentarily from the water. Fire and smoke erupted from the impact point. Internal bulkheads, designed to contain damage, simply vaporized under the force of the detonation. The Teiyo Maru lurched violently to one side, already taking on water at a rate that sealed her fate. Within minutes she would roll completely over, capsizing beneath the weight of seawater flooding through the massive rupture in her side. Behind Major Larner came 11 more Mitchells, each one repeating the deadly pattern with mechanical precision. Another pilot, a lieutenant named Ralph DeLeo, selected the Kios Maru itself as his target. Colonel Nakamura felt his ship shudder beneath his feet as machine gun fire tore through the superstructure. Soldiers trapped in the holds below deck screamed in terror and confusion as steel penetrated their cramped quarters. A bomb punched through the midships section, detonating deep within the engine room where it destroyed machinery and killed everyone in that space instantly. Metal screamed in protest. Flames erupted with a whooshing sound that was audible even over the thunder of battle. The Kios Maru lost power immediately, slowing and then stopping dead in the water, a sitting target for follow-up attacks. Nakamura found himself thrown violently against a bulkhead as his ship listed to one side. The world around him had become chaos incarnate. Everywhere he looked, destruction was multiplying at a rate that overwhelmed comprehension. The transport Nojima Maru took 3 direct hits in rapid succession and simply broke in half, her 2 sections folding away from each other before sliding beneath the waves. The Kyokusei Maru ignited like a torch as aviation fuel stored in her holds caught fire, flames rising hundreds of feet into the tropical air. Explosions continued to rock the convoy as bombs detonated below waterlines, rupturing boilers, tearing holes in hulls that were large enough to drive trucks through. In the span of less than 20 minutes, ships that had seemed solid and permanent were reduced to burning wrecks or had already disappeared beneath the surface. Aboard the destroyer Asashio, the commanding officer, a lieutenant commander named Sato, shouted orders that were lost in the overwhelming noise of battle. His ship's guns, designed primarily for surface combat against other warships, could not track targets that were moving at 300 miles per hour, barely 50 feet above the water. The weapons traversed too slowly. By the time gunners had a bomber in their sights, that aircraft had already passed over and was gone. Smaller caliber weapons had better traverse rates but lacked effective range. Gunners froze momentarily, stunned by the sight of aircraft roaring past so close that they could see the pilots' faces, see the expressions of concentration and fear and determination. Then the fire came, torrents of machine gun rounds that swept across their positions and killed them where they stood. Bombs skipped toward them with hideous precision, detonating against hulls with crushing force. One destroyer captain, driven to desperation, attempted something that would have seemed insane under normal circumstances. He ordered his helmsman to steer directly toward an approaching Mitchell, apparently intending to ram the aircraft, to destroy it by collision if guns could not bring it down. The American pilot saw the maneuver developing and reacted with split-second timing, hauling back on his controls and climbing sharply at the last possible instant. The bomber cleared the destroyer's mast by less than 10 feet. As it passed overhead, the dorsal gunner, who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, unleashed a sustained burst directly into the destroyer's bridge. Officers and crew died instantly. The destroyer, its steering now controlled by dead hands, veered wildly off course, smoke pouring from multiple fires that had erupted on its superstructure. For the Japanese sailors and soldiers caught in this maelstrom, the experience transcended normal categories of combat. Survivors would later describe the attacking Mitchells as fire-breathing dragons that had emerged from the sea itself, mythical creatures whose noses spat continuous streams of flame that connected heaven and hell. The carefully drilled convoy discipline that had been maintained for days simply disintegrated under the psychological impact of the attack. Some ships turned erratically, colliding with each other in desperate attempts to evade the bombs that skipped toward them with mechanical inevitability. Others slowed as engine rooms were destroyed, boilers ruptured, propeller shafts bent or broken, leaving them floating helplessly, while follow-up waves of attackers selected them for additional strikes. High above the low-level carnage, formations of B-17 flying fortresses added their weight to the assault, dropping bombs from altitude that forced the destroyer escorts to maintain formation and prevented them from concentrating their fire on the wave-top attackers. The assault came from every conceivable direction and altitude. High bombers, low-level skip bombers, strafing fighters, all coordinated in a symphony of destruction that overwhelmed the defences through sheer saturation. It seemed to the men being attacked as though the entire sky had become hostile, as though the sea itself had turned against them and spawned predators designed specifically to kill ships. By noon, when the sun reached its zenith over the Bismarck Sea, the convoy had ceased to exist as an organized formation. The Teyo Maru was gone, swallowed by smoke and water that closed over her like a grave. The Kios Maru, Colonel Nakamura's ship, listed heavily to one side, compartments flooding as men trapped below decks screamed for help that would never come. The Nojima Maru drifted in two separate pieces, both already settling toward the bottom. The Kembu Maru burned like a floating torch, flames consuming everything that would burn. The air itself seemed thick with oil smoke and the terrible smell of burned flesh. And then came the phase of the battle that would haunt the memories of those who participated, a phase that crossed lines that many had hoped war would never force them to cross. Survivors who had escaped from sinking ships now floated in the water, clinging to wreckage, gasping for air amid waves that were blackened with fuel oil. They thought perhaps that the worst was over. They were wrong. Allied bombers circled back, and their orders were cold and clear and brutally pragmatic. There would be no survivors. Guns raked the water, turning the surface into a froth of impacts. Bombs detonated among groups of floating men. Sailors raised their arms, begging the sky for mercy that military necessity refused to grant. Some pilots later confessed in diaries and letters home that this phase of the battle haunted them more than anything else they had done during the war. Yet they had obeyed orders. The logic was merciless but militarily sound. Every Japanese soldier who was rescued from the water today would fight tomorrow. Everyone who reached shore would rejoin the garrison at Leh and potentially kill Allied troops in future battles. Total war permitted no sentiment, no mercy that might prolong the conflict or cost additional Allied lives. Colonel Nakamura found himself in the water, the exact circumstances of how he got there forever lost in the chaos and trauma of those moments. He clung to a piece of wooden planking, one survivor among thousands, floating in an ocean that had been transformed into a nightmare. Around him floated bodies, some still moving weakly, others already still. Shattered crates and equipment drifted past. The oily debris of what had been a proud and confident convoy spread across the surface for miles. He lifted his head, water streaming from his face, and saw American bombers wheeling above like carrion birds, their wings catching the sunlight as they circled. He understood in that moment, with a clarity that comes only from witnessing the impossible made real, that the world had changed. The old certainties of naval warfare, the doctrine of convoy protection, the faith in destroyer escorts and anti-aircraft guns, all of it had died here today. He did not yet know whether he himself would live or die, but he knew with absolute certainty that Japan had lost something more important than ships or soldiers. They had lost their sense of security at sea. When the sun finally began its descent toward the western horizon, the Bismarck Sea had been transformed into a vast cemetery. 8 transports lay on the bottom, their hulls resting on sand and coral hundreds of feet below the surface. 4 destroyers had joined them in death, their proud bows pointed not toward battle anymore but toward darkness. Of the approximately 7,000 men who had embarked on this voyage with confidence and purpose, fewer than 1,300 would ever reach New Guinea. Allied losses, by comparison, were light. A handful of aircraft had been shot down. A few dozen airmen had died. The battle had lasted only hours, but in its fury and innovation, it had rewritten fundamental rules about how wars would be fought at sea. When the smoke finally cleared and the last bombers turned away toward home, leaving behind a silence broken only by the sound of water lapping against debris, the magnitude of what had occurred began to sink in. The toll was staggering in both human and material terms. Every single transport was gone, reduced to wreckage or resting on the seabed. 4 destroyer escorts, representing hundreds of millions of yen in construction costs and years of training for their crews, would never return to port. Nearly 7,000 men had set out on this convoy with orders and duties and lives they expected to live. Fewer than 1,300 survived to tell what had happened. For Japan, the loss was not merely statistical. It represented the complete destruction of an entire reinforcement plan, the silencing of thousands of rifles that would never fire in defense of New Guinea, the elimination of troops and supplies that could never be replaced quickly enough to matter. Among the survivors who were eventually pulled from the water, shock was the prevailing condition. Colonel Nakamura, rescued days later by Japanese forces who were searching desperately for any survivors they could find, struggled to put the experience into words. His initial reports described it as a vision of hell brought to earth, or perhaps more accurately, to sea. His testimony echoed what hundreds of other survivors reported independently. They spoke of disbelief at the speed of events, at the ferocity of the assault, at the sheer impossibility of defending against aircraft that attacked in ways no one had imagined possible. To the men who had experienced it, the B-25 Mitchell was no longer simply an aircraft whose designation they might find in identification manuals. It had become something mythical, a fire-breathing dragon that rose from the waves themselves, impossible to resist, bringing death in forms against which courage and training offered no defense. For the Allied nations, the battle produced headlines that celebrated victory and praised innovation. Newspapers across America, Australia, and other Allied countries trumpeted the annihilation of the Japanese convoy, holding it up as proof that the tide was turning in the Pacific. The stories spoke of American ingenuity defeating Japanese arrogance, of brave pilots pressing home attacks against overwhelming odds. To the civilian populations reading these accounts over breakfast tables thousands of miles from the battle, it was a clean victory, perhaps even glorious in its decisiveness. To the men who had actually flown those missions, however, the triumph came wrapped in more complicated emotions. Some of them could not forget the sight of men in the water, survivors begging for mercy before being cut down by orders that permitted no compassion. This was total war stripped of every illusion, and the memory of it would follow some of those pilots for the rest of their lives. Triumph and guilt proved inseparable, two sides of a coin that could not be divided. Strategically, the implications rippled outward immediately. Japanese military planners, stunned by the completeness of the disaster, reported the details directly to Tokyo. The information climbed the chain of command until it reached the highest levels of government. Emperor Hirohito himself received briefings on what had occurred in the Bismarck Sea. For a nation whose entire Pacific strategy depended on mobility across vast ocean distances, the implications were devastating. The doctrine of well-escorted convoys, which had seemed unshakable, had been shattered in a matter of hours. From that day forward, Japan essentially abandoned the concept of large-scale reinforcement by traditional convoy. The risks had become unacceptable. Instead, they would rely on submarines making night runs, fast destroyers racing to forward positions under cover of darkness, and other desperate measures that could move only a fraction of the troops and supplies that conventional convoys had carried. Even these alternative methods carried enormous risk. The wide Pacific Ocean, which had once served as a highway enabling Japanese expansion, had transformed into a trap where Allied aircraft ruled supreme. The psychological consequences of the battle extended far beyond the immediate participants. Word spread quickly through the Japanese Navy and Merchant Marine. Sailors began to genuinely fear the sight of B-25 Mitchells. Stories circulated, growing more elaborate with each retelling, about the flying destroyers, machines that could appear from the sea itself with no warning, breathing fire and raining bombs that skipped across the water like demons. Panic took root in places where discipline had once been absolute. Future convoys would scatter at the first sign of approaching aircraft, formation discipline cracking under the weight of fear that no amount of training could completely overcome. Officers found it increasingly difficult to maintain order when their crews had heard what happened in the Bismarck Sea. For the Allied forces, the lessons drawn from the battle were clear and immediately actionable. Innovation, born from desperation and refined through experimentation, had triumphed over established doctrine that refused to adapt. The 8-gun nose installation, which had started as one man's grief-driven determination to transform bombers into weapons of revenge, had proven its effectiveness beyond any doubt. Skip bombing, which had seemed almost suicidal in its requirements, had demonstrated accuracy rates that conventional high-altitude bombing could never match. These were no longer experimental techniques subject to debate. They had become proven doctrine, tested in battle and validated in blood. Training manuals were hastily rewritten to incorporate the new tactics. Factories increased production of the gunship variants, understanding that demand would only grow. Across the Pacific theatre, the nature of air-sea warfare had fundamentally changed. The future belonged to those who dared to fly low, who were willing to risk everything for the precision that close-range attack provided. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than a tactical victory on a checklist of engagements. It represented a genuine turning point, a moment when old assumptions about warfare died and new realities were born in fire. In less than a day of combat, American air power had proven that surface ships, even when escorted by destroyers and protected by trained anti-aircraft crews, were vulnerable to the point of helplessness when confronted by aircraft employing revolutionary tactics. The message resonated throughout both sides of the conflict. The rules that had governed naval warfare for generations had been rewritten in a single morning. And from the wreckage floating in the Bismarck Sea, a new era of military thinking emerged, one that would influence conflicts for decades to come. The wreckage of the convoy did not simply sink beneath the waves and disappear from memory. It lingered, both as physical debris scattered across miles of ocean and as a strategic wound that would not heal. The destruction of those 8 transports and their escorts marked the end of an era for Japanese Pacific operations. Never again would the Empire risk moving large numbers of troops across contested waters in conventional convoys. Their entire strategic posture, predicated on the ability to reinforce distant garrisons and maintain supply lines across vast distances, had been dealt a blow from which it would never recover. Garrisons throughout New Guinea and the surrounding islands would slowly starve, cut off from the reinforcements and supplies they needed to remain combat effective. The siege had begun, not with ground troops, but with the severing of maritime arteries. For the Allied forces, the battle's significance extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. It represented a fundamental shift in how air power was understood and employed. The dominance of the battleship, which had defined naval warfare for so long, was already fading in the face of aircraft carriers and naval aviation. But the Battle of the Bismarck Sea demonstrated that land-based aircraft, operating at extreme range, could achieve devastating results against surface fleets without requiring carrier support. No amount of destroyer escort, no doctrine of overlapping defensive fire could protect vulnerable cargo ships from aircraft that attacked at wave-top height with the kind of firepower the modified Mitchells brought to bear. The age of the great battleship was passing. The age of the aircraft, both carrier-based and land-based, had truly arrived. Manufacturing centres responded with impressive speed to the lessons learned. North American aviation ramped up production of B-25 variants specifically configured as gunships. The modifications that had started as field expedients, mechanics working with whatever materials they could scrounge, were now standardized on factory production lines. Technical manuals codified the tactics that had been developed through trial and error at primitive airfields. Pilots throughout the Pacific theatre studied detailed accounts of the Bismarck Sea engagement as if it were a sacred text, analysing what had worked and what could be improved. Training programs incorporated skip bombing as a standard skill rather than an experimental technique. The entire orientation of medium bomber operations shifted from high-altitude level bombing to low-level attack profiles that maximised accuracy and shock effect. Throughout Japanese-controlled territories, the psychological impact of the battle spread like wildfire. Sailors who had not been at the Bismarck Sea heard detailed accounts from the few survivors who had. The descriptions were remarkably consistent and deeply unsettling. aircraft approaching at impossible speeds across the wavetops, noses that seemed to be nothing but gun barrels spitting continuous fire, bombs that skipped across the water and struck exactly where ships were most vulnerable. The old confidence that had characterized Japanese merchant marine operations evaporated, replaced by genuine fear of what might appear over the horizon. Convoy duty, once considered routine if somewhat dangerous, became an assignment that sailors dreaded. The Mitchells had earned a reputation that transcended their actual capabilities, becoming almost supernatural in the stories that circulated through Japanese bases. But beyond the technical innovations and the psychological warfare, the battle carried deeper philosophical implications about the nature of warfare itself. It demonstrated conclusively that wars are not won by the side with the most resources, or even necessarily the bravest troops. Victory goes to those who can adapt, who can look at familiar tools and imagine radically different ways to employ them. The B-25 Mitchell had not been designed as a ship killer. It had been created as a medium bomber for conventional operations. But a handful of officers, driven by desperation and grief and an unwillingness to accept failure, had reimagined what was possible. They had looked at that aircraft and seen not what it was, but what it could become. That act of imagination, combined with the courage to test radical ideas under combat conditions, had created a weapon system that changed the course of the Pacific War. Colonel Nakamura, who survived his ordeal in the water and eventually made his way back to Japan, would write extensively about his experience in the years that followed. His accounts provide some of the most vivid descriptions of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that revolutionary attack. He described it as the day Japan learned to fear the air, the moment when the Empire's confident assumptions about naval supremacy were shattered beyond repair. His writings captured a broader truth that extended beyond military tactics. Innovation, when successfully implemented, does more than achieve immediate objectives. It reshapes the psychological landscape, forcing enemies to confront the reality that old methods no longer work, that cherished doctrines have become obsolete, that the rules themselves have changed. For Japan, that realization came too late to reverse the tide of war. In the broader arc of history, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea occupies an important place as a case study in military innovation under pressure. The battle demonstrated that desperation, rather than being a weakness, can be a powerful driver of creativity when channeled properly. The Allied forces in the Pacific during early 1943 were losing. Traditional approaches to interdicting Japanese supply lines had failed repeatedly. But rather than accepting defeat or simply trying harder with the same failed methods, key individuals were willing to question fundamental assumptions and try radically different approaches. That willingness to innovate, to accept risk, to potentially waste resources on ideas that might not work, created the conditions for breakthrough success. The legacy of those modified Mitchells extended into the post-war period as well. The concept of heavily armed gunships, aircraft designed primarily to suppress ground or surface targets with overwhelming firepower rather than precision bombing, would influence military aviation development for decades. The AC-130 gunships that would later serve in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts, bristling with howitzers and cannons, traced their conceptual lineage back to Paul Gunn's 8-gun Mitchell nose. The idea that an aircraft could function as a flying artillery platform, that it could achieve effects through sustained fire rather than single bomb drops, became embedded in military doctrine because of what happened over the Bismarck Sea. Perhaps the final and most important legacy of the battle lies in what it teaches about adaptation and survival. In warfare, as in biology, the species or the doctrine that survives is not necessarily the strongest or the most numerous. It is the one that can adapt most effectively to changing conditions. Japan entered the Pacific War with sophisticated doctrine, well-trained forces, and enormous confidence in their methods. They had carefully studied naval warfare and created what they believed was an unbeatable system of convoy protection. They had not imagined that the rules themselves could be changed, that aircraft could attack in ways their doctrine never anticipated. The Allies, facing defeat, were forced to innovate or perish. They chose innovation. They questioned assumptions. They tried ideas that seemed dangerous or even ridiculous, and in doing so, they created new realities that their enemies could not counter. The waters of the Bismarck Sea eventually returned to their normal state, the oil slicks dispersing, the wreckage settling into coral and sand, the physical evidence of the battle gradually fading. But the impact of what happened there on that March morning in 1943 never faded. It remained as a permanent marker in the history of warfare, a demonstration that technology matters less than imagination, that courage without innovation achieves little, and that wars are ultimately won by those who can see beyond the limitations of current doctrine to imagine what might be possible. Steel rusts, ships sink, specific tactics become obsolete. But the principle that drove the transformation of the B-25 Mitchell from conventional bomber to sea-level predator remains eternally relevant. Innovation, born from necessity and executed with determination, reshapes not just individual battles, but the entire future of how wars are fought and won.